We have a very special guest here with us today in Studio 33 AD. This mystery man in a very unique outfit is not a common occurrence here in the Treasure Valley. So we're going to let him introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his story, but then also the larger story of who he represents and the very special group that he belongs to.
So, yeah, my name is Father Peter Hanna. I'm a Dominican friar. If you see our names formally written, it's OP, as are the initials afterwards, which stands for the Order of Preachers. And we're an order that goes back to the 13th century, founded by Saint Dominic in 1216. And we've been around ever since. I am a member of the Western Dominican Province, so that's the region of Dominicans in the western United States. I happen to come up to Boise usually at least once a year, sometimes more than that, because I have family up here. My sister and her family have lived here for about the last 10 years or so here. We grew up, myself and my sister and parents, my family, I grew up in California, Monterey, California. And, I could go into my whole vocation story. I don't know if you want me to do that right now, or if you want to just tell me.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. My story of discernment really starts when I was young. So I'm a convert to the Catholic faith. I was raised in the Presbyterian Church in Monterey, California. And, I grew up with a very good, I'm very thankful, very blessed in my parents and all they provided for me. Never recall being in, sort of particular need of things. They provided for me and my sister. We had good educations. And we grew up with a religious training as well. My dad especially was very firm on Sunday church attendance. So even when I got a little older and started not wanting to go to church, my dad was always very firm, we're going to church on Sundays. So I grew up in the Presbyterian Church again in Monterey. And that kind of habit of piety growing up really, I think, took root at me at a young age, even though I wouldn't have been conscious of it or been able to articulate exactly what it meant at the time. Then, when I got into about high school, I took a passionate interest in the game of golf. So, as I was sharing with you a couple days ago, John, I played a lot of golf when I was growing up, and I ended up playing on the high school golf team. I ended up playing college golf at UC San Diego, and when I began to get interested in golf through my high school years, I began to want to spend more time on the golf course and less in church. So had a number of, let's call them, I guess, arguments with my parents over church attendance or not, and we ended up on a kind of compromise where I think they said, okay, well, as long as you come to church on one Sunday a month, and then we'll let you do whatever you want aside from that.
And you are one of the most viewed folks on YouTube as the golfing priest. Is that right?
Yeah. I told you the story a couple days ago. So just a couple, actually about last year or so, I learned from an English Dominican friar that I knew when I was in Europe. I been in Rome for the last 3 years doing studies. That apparently I was famous and I didn't know it. He said he knew that I was a golfer, and for some reason he was searching online for golfing priests. And I learned then that I think it's still, I don't think I'm number one anymore. I think I'm like third or fourth. The algorithms on these things change. But if you search Google Images for golfing priest, I come up near the top. So I'm actually wearing my habit and my kappa, and I'm doing this follow through, and it's a link through to an article that was written for National Catholic Register, I believe, and they got the photo from a golf tournament fundraiser that my province did when I was a student in formation 10 some odd years ago, where they wanted me to pose as a golfer. So yeah, I am on the internet, whatever that means. I don't know, maybe not a lot these days.
There you are. You've arrived, and here now as well.
Actually, when I was in high school, you could say I kind of fell away from practicing Christianity much, although it wasn't a rebellion. I didn't sort of ever become a conscious atheist or something like this. I just figured, I believed in God, but I had other things I wanted to do with my life. And at that time, I wanted to be a professional golfer, and I pursued that sort of dream through college. In a way, I would put the emphasis on wanted to be. I think when you get older, or I got into college, I started to realize how large of a field it is, or rather how small of a field it is that actually makes it to the PGA Tour. But nevertheless, I kind of wanted to do something with golf in my life, and I probably would have ended up as a club pro somewhere, as a golf course somewhere. But in any case, I pursued that through college, and then in college, I basically did three things. I was in school, I was playing golf, and I joined a fraternity. So I was in a fraternity, and the fraternity life came with all the things that go with fraternity life in the United States. I'll say that there are, I think, a number of positive things about fraternities in terms of leadership skills. They train you in a certain collaboration with other, your peers and so forth, and a certain kind of fraternal spirit among your fraternity brothers. But indeed, there is a party culture as well that goes along with fraternities that after about 3 years of that, I became kind of disillusioned with. And that was my own kind of search. I was in college asking questions about what I wanted to do with life, and wondering, if golf was really a path I wanted to take, or if it wasn't, what else I wanted to do. And so I started kind of asking larger questions about what I'm doing here and what the purpose of life was. And by the time I got to my senior year, actually it was the summer that was between my junior and senior years, I think I was kind of ripe for a kind of conversion, and that happened essentially. I was going out to play golf with my dad. On one summer day, we were visiting my grandparents up in Missoula, Montana. And my dad and I went out to a diner beforehand, before we played golf, common ritual, right? And my dad actually kind of challenged me. He said, "Peter, I think I would have been, about 20 years old, I guess, at the time. I think you should become a member at our church, our Presbyterian church," because I had never become a formal member. My sister actually had, who's younger than I am. And my parents were members, but he said, "I think you should become a member." So my first reaction was, I'd want to study other religions first, which is a pretty common kind of instinct, I think, for young people to have today, because the world has a lot of versions, or a lot of religions, a lot of possibilities. So my dad said, "Well, that's fair enough, but for Christianity," he said, "I would recommend a book by C.S. Lewis," so the Chronicles of Narnia author, called Mere Christianity. And some of your listeners may have heard of Mere Christianity. I still, even as a Catholic priest, recommend it as a really good articulation of the essentials of kind of the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. And he also addresses a number of objections that frequently come up in modern people's minds relative to science and morality and so forth. In any case, we went out golfing, and then afterwards, kind of indication of where I was in my life at that point. I said, "Dad, let's go get that book." And he said, "Sure." So we went to Barnes & Noble, when bookstores still existed. And I came out with two books that were kind of captured my life at that point. One was Mere Christianity, and the other was the autobiography of Jack Nicklaus. So we left the Barnes & Noble. I started reading Mere Christianity on the plane ride back to Monterey, where my family lived at the time. And I just plowed through it. I devoured it. It was like water in the desert for me. Lewis raised a number of objections, and had a way of sort of speaking to objections to Christianity, and from a more kind of philosophical and theological angle, but in a very accessible way. I mean, I hadn't read any philosophy or theology at that point in my life, but as I read through it, I was simply convicted. He went through and described who Christ is and what the Christian faith proposes, and I think I read through the book in about 2 or 3 days. And at the end of it, I just said to myself, I think this is true. I am a Christian, and this is the path that is true, and that I want to follow. Now, I think, having said that conversion, as it were, there were lots of seeds planted in my growing up years. My parents had raised me in the faith. A lot of these ideas about who Christ was and what Christianity was were in me, but I hadn't ever kind of gone back to them at a later point in my life after college. So I became a member at the Presbyterian Church, and I ended up taking up a habit of praying every morning. I just said, I was a kind of an athlete, I guess. I played basketball and I enjoyed playing sports growing up and played golf in college, and so I was used to kind of discipline and practice. And so I said, well, I've made this commitment to Christ. I need to do something. So I decided to read one chapter of the Gospels every morning. And so that summer, I spent 15-20 minutes reading a chapter of the Gospels and praying a little bit before and after, and it completely transformed my life. It completely gave me kind of a renewed look at why I was here on earth, what God was calling me to, what the most important things in life were. And especially for me at that time, to that time in my life, I had really kind of defined my life around how well I did in golf and how successful I was in, school and, whatever, social life in the fraternity or whatnot. But when I began to commit my life to Christ in those months, it really kind of helped me reorganize all of those commitments around fidelity to Christ and following Christ. So after that, I went back to Monterey, where I'd grown up, and I actually became a youth minister at the First Presbyterian Church in Monterey. I did that for a year and a half. I was a minister to high school students and junior high students, and ran Bible studies, did events, did a mission trip to Mexico. It was really a fruitful time in a lot of ways. And I got more interested in going back to school, partially because I continued to read C.S. Lewis, and through C.S. Lewis I started getting interested in Catholic authors. So I stumbled across G.K. Chesterton's writings, and I also discovered the monastic writer of the last century, the great monastic writer Thomas Merton. Mm-hmm. And so I read Thomas Merton's Seven Storey Mountain. I read a bit of G.K. Chesterton. I also, didn't hurt, I was dating for a little bit, a Mexican-American young woman. Excuse me. She actually began taking me to some retreats that were run by a congregation of Catholic sisters called Verbum Dei. And so even though I wouldn't have made a hard distinction at that time in my life between Catholicism and Protestantism, for me it was just kind of, everything's Christ, I began to be attracted to many aspects of Catholic spirituality. There's the depth, there seemed to be a depth of intellectual and spiritual resources and tradition in the Catholic Church that were distinct. So as I'm sort of continuing this journey of growth in Christ, I guess you could say, I was led to go back to St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, which is a great books program. And I don't know if your listeners are familiar with those kinds of programs, but they're classics. You read a lot of philosophy, kind of classics of the Western canon. And it was a really fruitful place, and it was there where I actually came into the Catholic Church after about 3 years there. And essentially, there were two, to make a long story very sort of in a nutshell. There were kind of two developments I experienced in my time at St. John's. The first one was an intellectual development where I read more and more into Catholic history and Catholic theologians, so I discovered St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, who were part of the program at St. John's. Outside of that, I discovered John Henry Cardinal Newman, continued reading G.K. Chesterton, started reading some of the documents of the Second Vatican Council because they were recommended to me by a Christian brother, the Congregation of Christian Brothers, who there was a tutor at St. John's at the time, one of my mentors in a way there. And I just became more and more persuaded of and convinced by Catholic theology, the truth of the Catholic faith, and the way that the Catholic Church had of combining faith and reason. And I could go into a lot of depth there, but in some ways there are typically two instincts in practicing Christianity or Christian identity, I would say. And you'd see this all over Christian history and today in the United States. One instinct can be a kind of what's called a fideism, to emphasize the faith assertions that we make. So I believe this, and I believe it, and I believe it, and therefore everything I believe is true. Or it works more off the faith kind of presumption, more of a fundamentalist in a way attitude. There's another instinct with which takes seriously the questions that reason and human reason proposes. So questions in the sciences or regarding evolution or something like this. And typically you can kind of go in one or the other directions. Sometimes you can become so committed to the questions that reason proposes and frustrated because reason can't give you all the answers, that you start abandoning some of the faith commitments that are actually important to Christianity. On the other hand, sometimes you can just sort of use the Bible or Catholic tradition as a kind of trump card to just eliminate any possible question, or Christian tradition, we could say. Catholicism and Catholic theology seem to have this way of synthesizing both. And there was always a good and nuanced answer that took seriously the things we believe as Catholics, but was open to reason and to rational inquiry, and said, no, there are certain things we need to believe, but there's a whole area of things about God that we believe that actually are not accessible by reason. It leaves room for mystery. So there was an intellectual sort of bent to my journey at St. John's, and then there was a spiritual bent. And the spiritual bent was my own prayer life, which eventually culminated in a discovery of the Blessed Sacrament at a perpetual adoration chapel in Annapolis, Maryland. And I literally started going to this chapel because it was the only place to pray early in the morning in Annapolis. I was started to work a part-time job, so I had to go pray early in the morning because I was kind of trying to decide whether to become Catholic, and it was kind of starting to weigh on me a bit, like this decision of becoming Catholic or not was going to shape the rest of my life. So I decided to get up early in the morning. It was winter in Annapolis, cold, I remember, and the only church that was open was the Catholic Church's Perpetual Adoration Chapel. So I stumbled in there one winter morning, and I'm sure I looked like a deer in the headlights because I went into this adoration chapel, and there were two people there, and I didn't know what it was, and I kind of looked around. I didn't genuflect or anything, and it's probably obvious to them that I had never been there before, or I didn't know what I was doing. So I sat down in the back pew, and there were two parishioners, I guess, in front of me. And my first reaction to adoration, so if your listeners, most of them are familiar, but if you aren't, there's a monstrance where you expose the Blessed Sacrament, the body and blood of Christ, on the altar. And the place was just utterly silent. It was just deathly silent. And they were just staring at what appeared to me to be a piece of bread, right? Because that's, in the Presbyterian tradition, the communion host is a symbol of Christ's body and blood, purely a symbol. And so I thought this was a little odd. Why would you just stare at the communion bread? But I stayed there. And as I began to go back and back again over the next weeks, several weeks, I began to experience the presence of God. And I didn't have an explanation for it. I knew what the Catholic Church taught about the Eucharist, and I kind of finally figured out, okay, it's the body and blood of Christ, so it's up on the altar, and they're just sort of sitting in its presence or something. But after about 2 or 3 weeks or a month there, I came to believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and that's what kind of gave me the infusion of faith from God's grace to make the decision to enter the Catholic Church. So I entered in 2004, and then I started to discern a vocation immediately. And I kind of knew in my discernment in my time at St. John's that if I became Catholic, priesthood might be in the offing, and so I knew that was part of what put more pressure on the drastic effect it was going to have in my life. And so when I became Catholic, I started discerning vocation, and ended up going back actually to Monterey, and I taught high school for a year, Latin for a year at the high school that I had gone to in Monterey, actually Pebble Beach, California. And during that year, I went and did a come and see weekend which is a vocational kind of promotion weekend with the Western Dominican province up in Oakland at St. Albert's Priory, which is our house of studies up there. And so I did a weekend up there, and I remember when I came back from that weekend, there was a missionary of charity sister who would go to daily mass at the Carmel Mission Basilica, which is in the Monterey Peninsula. And, I had an idea after I came back. It was a good weekend. It was inspiring to me. The Dominican charism attracted me. And I had an idea that I was probably going to join, but I was still trying to kind of discern. And I remember she knew I had been up there that weekend, and I saw her outside of one of the daily masses the Monday after I'd returned. And she said, so, she was this little, short sister. She looked up and she said, so, how'd your weekend go? And I said it was good. And I guess I started to smile. And she looked straight at me and she said, you're beaming. You're going to become a Dominican. To which I wasn't aware that I was beaming, as she put it, but apparently I was looking fairly satisfied and happy about my time that weekend. And so I made the decision to enter, and I joined the Dominican Order, the Western Dominican Province, in the fall of 2006, August of 2006, and then went through my whole 8 years of formation with the Dominicans, and I was ordained in 2014. And I basically have been in 2 places now as a Dominican, now 3, I guess, but I was on assignment. My first assignment was in Salt Lake City, Utah, at the University of Utah's Newman Center. It's a parish that functions as the chaplaincy for the University of Utah, and also parishioners that come from the area. And I was there for 3 years, and then after that, my province sent me to Rome to get a degree in sacred scripture. So I just finished a licensed degree, an SSL as it's called, at the Biblicum in Rome. And now I am back in Oakland, and I'll begin teaching 1 course this coming semester in wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So that's my life in 15 minutes or whatever. So yeah, the Dominican Order, as I think I mentioned before, we were founded in 1216 by St. Dominic, who got his approval from the Pope at the time, Pope Honorius III. And when we were founded, we were kind of a new idea, or you might say a kind of radical idea, because at that time in Europe, typically you would either be a priest working, under your bishop in a parish, saying masses for people and so forth, or you would be a monk in a monastery. So the Benedictine order would be kind of the classic example, or sort of the reference point that probably most Catholics have for monastic life, or on the other hand, female religious orders, monastic orders as well. So at the time, St. Dominic thought that what Europe needed, and specifically where St. Dominic came from, was northern Spain. There was a particular heresy that was running about in northern Spain and southern France at the time, called the Albigensian Heresy. And this heresy regarded, among other things, matter and the material and physical world as evil. So the Catholic faith had always had a different position than that, going back to Scripture and through the Fathers, which is that the material world is good because it's created by God, even though it needs redemption or sanctification and transformation in God's grace and goodness and so forth. So St. Dominic realized that the Albigensian heresy had its proponents were fairly intellectually sophisticated. So he had the idea to found an order that would have a kind of monastic style of life, a common life, where you wear a habit, you chant and pray the Psalms in common, you're living, simply vows of poverty, or living a life of poverty and chastity and obedience under a superior, like a monastic order, but that would have the freedom to go out and preach. And specifically in their preaching mission would have a deep intellectual formation and theological and philosophical formation that would equip the friars to go out and preach. Now, St. Dominic was actually not a friar at first. He was a canon that was associated with one of the cathedrals, one of the bishops, Bishop of Osma in northern Spain. But he founded the Dominican Order with this idea, and we sort of caught wildfire. Now, our kind of brother order, you could say at the time, were the Franciscans. And the Franciscans were friars as well, so they were traveling about preaching, but their focus tended to be more on encouraging piety and devotion and assisting the poor often, as they do today as well. Dominicans had from the beginning a kind of intellectual and contemplative dimension to our life, where we would contemplate, and study became an important part of Dominican life. Contemplation and study would form you in not only a devotion to God and a seeking of union with God as a monk would, but also with a certain devotion to truth, and an understanding and a willingness to study everything that was relevant to becoming more learned, so you could teach and preach the faith more effectively. So this identity, charism as it's called in our order, really was attractive to me because St. Dominic's order, the Dominican order, combines both a contemplative life and an active life. So the phrase that comes from the origins of our order is that we contemplate and then we share the fruits of contemplation with others. That kind of double dynamic. And one perhaps helpful way to think of it is kind of on a spectrum. So you can imagine Catholic religious orders or congregations, or priestly life as well, I guess, on a kind of spectrum. If on one side you have contemplative orders, the purely contemplative orders like Benedictines or Trappist monks or Carthusians or whatnot, and then on the other side you have kind of purely active orders or more purely active orders. Every religious or priest or Catholic prays, obviously, but you have kind of more purely active modes of life. So the Franciscans, a lot of sisters, congregations working in hospitals or teaching or whatnot. Or your diocesan priest who's very active. Jesuit orders would be typically more active model of life. Whereas Dominicans are kind of right in between, where we combine a contemplative posture towards life, towards Scripture above all, and the deposit of faith, and a certain devotion to the sacred liturgy and guarding the sacred liturgy and cultivating a life of prayer out of the liturgy, but then also devoted to study and to sharing the fruits of what we've been contemplating with that aspect of study with others. So, but especially in the United States, actually, in the Western United States, because the U.S. Church, when the bishops came to the U.S. and it was kind of charted territory as far as the Catholic presence there, in the 1800s, the bishops in the West tended to appeal more readily and quickly to religious orders that were here, Benedictines, Dominicans, whoever, because they needed work. They needed people to staff the parishes, and they didn't have as many men. So it certainly can vary. And so, for example, my own Western Dominican province was founded in California in the mid-19th century, and the bishop at the time wanted us, actually one of our founding members of our order, Bishop Alamany, became a bishop and ended up corralling many of us Dominicans to do parochial work as well. But you do get Benedictine abbeys having different models of how much ministry or not they kind of engage in. Some Benedictine abbeys, and it depends on the abbey, will be more strictly confined to the monastery and the contemplative life within the abbey, and then others have different models where they'll be teaching at universities or supplying parishes or whatnot.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us here at St. John's Cathedral and at Studio 33 AD. Thanks for sharing your story.
My pleasure, and God's blessings on the entire Diocese of Boise.
Thank you.